When she came out of the garage, I was sitting in the middle of the kitchen like some kind of game show host, my chair perfectly aligned with the laundry room door. In front of me was a small table I dragged in from the living room, and on it sat a collection of carefully selected props. After all, every great performance needs the right setup. "Brian," she called out hesitantly, her voice laced with confusion. "What are you doing? Is something wrong?" "Not at all," I replied. My tone is smooth as butter. "Actually, I thought you might help me with a little fitting." "A fitting?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "What fitting? What are you talking about?" I leaned forward dramatically, picking up one of the items from the table with a flourish. "This," I said, holding it up like a magician revealing the finale of his trick. Her face twisted into a mix of confusion and disgust. "What is that?" she asked. "What's going on, Brian? Is this some kind of weird joke?" "Joke?" I said, feigning offense. "Rachel, I would never joke about something this important. This is a manhood cage. You know, a chastity device." Her eyes widened to cartoonish proportions like a pair of overinflated balloons threatening to pop. I half expected them to fall out and roll across the floor. "And what?" she shrieked. "Are you out of your mind?" "No, not at all," I said, completely unbothered. "In fact, I've done a lot of research on this. Apparently, cuckolded husbands like me are supposed to wear these things. It's tradition. You, of course, would wear the key on a lovely chain around your neck. And when your bowl is finished, you let me out?" If you feel like it, her face turned a deep shade of red as she stared at me in stunned silence. For a moment, I thought she might actually combust. "Abul," she finally sputtered. "What the hell are you talking about? And what is that disgusting thing?" She pointed at the cage like it was a venomous snake. "The bull," I explained patiently, "is the guy who makes love to the wife. You know, the alpha male. Meanwhile, the husband, that's me, cleans up afterward. It's all very proper." She looked at me like I just sprouted a second head. "You're insane," she said, her voice shaking. "This is insane. Where did you even come up with this nonsense?" "Oh, just some light reading," I said, shrugging. "You'd be amazed what you can learn when you have a lot of time to think." Her fists clenched at her sides, and she took a step closer. "You're accusing me of something," she hissed. "Aren't you?" "Accusing?" I repeated, pretending to be shocked. "Rachel, that's such an ugly word. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just adapting. You've been seeing Greg Johnson, haven't you? I figured it was time for me to learn my new role." Her jaw dropped, and for a second, she looked like a fish gasping for air. "How long have you known?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, since February 11th, I said casually. 7:44 p.m., to be exact. Would you like the minutes, or is that precise enough for you?" Her mouth opened and closed again, and I couldn't help but think she resembled a carp flopping on dry land. It was almost impressive. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you confront me? What was there to say?" I asked, shrugging. "Rachel, you cheating fool? Or maybe, why are you doing this to me?" Somehow, I didn't think those would help. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she stammered. "It just happened. It wasn't serious." "Not serious?" I said with a laugh. "Oh, Rachel, you and Greg have been having a whole lot of not serious fun, haven't you? I mean, you must really enjoy his company if you're willing to risk everything for it." Tears filled her eyes, but I wasn't about to let her crocodile sob story sway me. "You're a sociopath," I added, my voice cold. "That's why you did it." She gasped, her hands flying to her chest. "How can you say that?" she whispered. "I thought you loved me. What does love have to do with it?" I asked. "I did love you, Rachel, before I found out you were a lying, cheating sociopath. Now, not so much." Her lips quivered, and for a moment, she looked like she might faint. Instead, she sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "What do you want from me?" she asked softly. "I want you to face the truth," I said. "And while you're at it, maybe work on those fish lips. You're almost there, but they need to droop a little more to really sell the carp look." She stared at me, completely at a loss for words. Rachel's lips trembled as she stared at me, a strange cocktail of anger, fear, and confusion flickering in her eyes. "What is wrong with you, Brian?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. "Why are you acting like this? Why are you saying these insane things?" I tilted my head slightly, as if genuinely pondering her question. Oh, Rachel. I'm not insane, I said, my tone dripping with faux sincerity. I'm just enlightened. You see, I've been doing some reading, learning about the noble art of cuckoldry, and I thought it was high time I stepped into my new role. Her face turned crimson, and she took a step back, like a cornered animal. What are you even talking about? She demanded, her voice rising. What is this nonsense about a bowl and that disgusting thing you showed me? I sighed theatrically as if disappointed by her ignorance. The bull, Rachel, is the alpha male. The one you, how should I put this delicately, enjoy spending your extracurricular hours with. Meanwhile, I, the humble husband, get the honor of observing, cleaning up, supporting you in your endeavors. Her jaw dropped so dramatically I half expected it to hit the floor. You're insane, she spat. You've completely lost your mind. Insane? I repeated, clutching my chest as if wounded. Rachel, that's not very supportive of you. I'm trying to embrace this new lifestyle you've so generously introduced me to. I mean, come on. Isn't Greg Johnson the bull in your little rodeo? Her eyes widened and her face drained of color. Bingo. Greg, she stammered. What does Greg have to do with this? Oh, come on, Rachel, I said, rolling my eyes. Don't insult my intelligence. You've been sneaking around with him since February 11th, 7:44 p.m., to be precise. Would you like the address too? Because I've got that as well. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. A carp specifically. It was uncanny, really. How long have you known? She finally whispered. I leaned back in my chair, lacing my fingers behind my head. Long enough, I said simply. And before you ask why I didn't say anything sooner, let me save you the trouble. What was I supposed to do, Rachel? Burst in and yell, caught you. Somehow, I didn't think that would make much of a difference. Tears started to well up in her eyes, but I wasn't about to let that sway me. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice cracking. It wasn't serious, Brian. It didn't mean anything. I laughed. A short, bitter sound. Of course, it didn't mean anything. Cheating never does, right? It's just meaningless fun at someone else's expense. How noble of you. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm. Please, she said softly. Please don't do this. It's over. I swear it's over. I'll never see him again, right? I said, pulling my arm away. Because you've been so honest and trustworthy up to this point. Her tears started to fall freely now, streaking her cheeks as she sank into the chair across from me. I was stupid. She sobbed. I wasn't thinking. I hate myself for what I did. Good, I said coldly. You should. Because I've had weeks to think about it, Rachel. Weeks to picture you with him. Weeks to wonder what I did wrong. And you know what I realized? It wasn't me. It was you. It was always you. Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse entirely. I love you, Brian, she said through her tears. I swear, I do. It was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. I leaned forward, my expression cold and unyielding. You love me? I asked. Is that what you're going with? Because, Rachel, if this is your idea of love, I want no part of it. She shook her head frantically, her hands clutching at her hair. What do I have to do to fix this? She begged. Tell me. I'll do anything. I sat back, crossing my arms over my chest. Anything? I repeated. Fine. Start by getting tested. Her head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes wide with shock. What? You heard me, I said. An STD test. If you're serious about fixing this, that's step one. Brian, I would never don't, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't tell me what you would or wouldn't do. I don't trust you, Rachel. So yeah, I want you to get tested. No arguments. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I'll do it tomorrow. First thing. Good, I said simply, standing up. We'll see what the results say. The next morning, Rachel left early. I didn't bother asking where she was going. We both knew. When she returned a few hours later, she clutched a slip of paper in her hand like it was her ticket to redemption. I did it, she announced, holding the paper out to me. They said the results will be ready by Friday. I glanced at the paper briefly, then set it down on the counter. Good, I said. We'll wait. Her face fell slightly, like she'd expected more than my cold indifference. Brian, This is proof that I'm serious, she said, her voice tinged with desperation. Doesn't that mean anything to you? It means you followed instructions, I said flatly. That's a start. Her lips parted as if she was about to argue, but then she thought better of it. Instead, she turned and left the kitchen. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. I didn't stop her. That evening, I settled onto the couch with a beer and turned on ESPN. The familiar drone of commentators filled the room, drowning out the uncomfortable silence that had taken root in the house. Rachel walked in a few minutes later, carrying a plate of my favorite stuffed pork chops. Dinner's ready, she said softly, setting the plate down in front of me. I raised an eyebrow. Pork chops? Haven't had those in a while. I thought you might like them, she said, twisting her hands nervously. You always said they were your favorite. I nodded, picking up my fork. Thanks. She hovered in the doorway for a moment, watching as I took a bite. Good? She asked hesitantly. Yeah, I said. Not bad. Her face lit up briefly, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a smile. I went back to eating, focusing on the game instead of her. She lingered a moment longer before retreating to the kitchen. Friday came faster than I expected. Rachel met me at the door when I got home, her face a mix of excitement and anxiety. She held an envelope in her hands like it was some sort of sacred offering. See? She said, shoving the envelope toward me. Negative. Just like I told you. I took the envelope from her and glanced at the results inside. Negative. No surprises there. Good to know, I said, handing it back to her. Doesn't this prove something to you? She asked, her voice trembling. Doesn't it show that I'm trying? I set my bag down and leaned against the counter, studying her. It proves you don't have an STD, I said. That's about it. Her face fell, and she clutched the envelope to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her together. Brian, I'm doing everything I can to make this right, she said, tears pooling in her eyes. Why can't you see that? Because some things can't be fixed, Rachel, I said simply. No matter how hard you try. Her tears spilled over, and she let out a shaky sob. I love you, she whispered. I'll keep saying it until you believe me. I looked at her, my face unreadable. Love isn't enough, I said. Not anymore. That night, she crawled in a bed beside me, her body curling toward mine. I could feel the heat of her skin, the soft sound of her breath, but I didn't move. I stayed stiff and still, staring at the ceiling. After a while, she sighed and rolled over, her back to me. For the first time in our marriage, the bed felt like a battlefield and neither of us was willing to surrender. Friday's tension lingered into the weekend. Rachel was quiet but persistent, like a storm brewing just below the surface. I could feel her watching me as I moved through the house, cooking up whatever plan she thought might save her. She didn't realize the ship had already sunk. Sunday evening, the doorbell rang as I was cleaning up after dinner. Rachel poked her head out from the living room. Are you expecting someone? She asked cautiously. Nope, I said, drying my hands. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man built like a linebacker wearing a tailored suit. He held an envelope in one hand and didn't bother with pleasantries. Brian Harper? He asked. That's me, I replied. He handed me the envelope. You've been served, he said in a deep, gruff voice before turning on his heel and walking away. I shut the door and turned back to see Rachel standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. What is that? She asked, her voice barely audible. I held up the envelope. Divorce papers, I said simply. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, bumping into the wall. No, she whispered. No, Brian. You don't mean that. I've never been clearer, I said, setting the envelope on the table. She stared at it like it was a live grenade. We don't need a divorce, she said, shaking her head. I told you. It's over. I'll never see him again. Rachel, this isn't about Greg anymore, I said. My voice calm but firm. This is about trust, and there's none left. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. You're throwing away everything we've built. No, Rachel, I said, leaning against the counter. You threw it away the moment you decided he was worth more than me. Her face crumpled, and she sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands. I watched her for a moment, a strange mix of pity and detachment swirling in my chest. Then I turned and left the room. The next morning, She cornered me in the kitchen. Her eyes were red and puffy, but her voice was steady. What if we went to counseling? She asked, her tone almost pleading. I raised an eyebrow. Counseling? Yes, she said quickly. We could work through this together. I'll do whatever it takes. I let out a long breath, crossing my arms. Rachel, counseling can't fix what's broken here. You don't know that, she said, her voice rising. You haven't even tried. I shook my head, because I know it won't work. Trust isn't something you can patch up with a few therapy sessions. Once it's gone, it's gone. Her shoulders slumped, but she didn't back down. If I set it up, will you go? She asked quietly. I stared at her for a long moment before sighing. Fine, set it up, but don't expect a miracle. The sessions were a disaster. The counselor, a balding man with a soft voice and too much optimism, seemed hell-bent on convincing me that healing was possible. Rachel latched onto every word he said, nodding eagerly and offering tearful apologies. I, on the other hand, went through the motions, answering his questions with just enough effort to avoid looking uncooperative. By the 5th session, I'd had enough. As we sat in the counselor's dimly lit office, he leaned forward with a hopeful smile. Brian, do you think you could find it in your heart to forgive Rachel? I stared at him for a moment, then leaned back in my chair. Forgiveness isn't the issue, I said. It's trust, and I can't trust her. Not anymore. Rachel's face crumpled and tears started streaming down her cheeks. The counselor frowned, clearly disappointed. Perhaps we can explore ways to rebuild that trust, he said. It will take time and effort, but no. I interrupted, standing up. I'm done. Brian, wait. Rachel began, but I was already heading for the door. Back at home, Rachel was unrelenting. Why won't you even try? She demanded, following me from the kitchen to the living room. You said you'd go to counseling, and now you're just giving up? I didn't give up, Rachel, I said, turning to face her. You did. The moment you decided Greg was worth the risk, you gave up on us. Her hands clenched into fists, her face twisted with frustration. I've done everything I can to fix this, she shouted. Why can't you see that? Because some things can't be fixed, I said simply. And this is one of them. Rachel's efforts didn't stop after counseling failed. If anything, they became more desperate. She cooked my favorite meals every night, left handwritten notes tucked into my work bag, and even started wearing that blue dress I once told her she looked stunning in. It was like watching someone try to rebuild a house that had already burned to the ground. One evening, as I walked into the kitchen, she met me with an envelope in her hands. Here, she said quietly, holding it out to me. I signed the papers. I took the envelope, surprised by her sudden surrender. You're not contesting anymore? I asked. She shook her head, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. What's the point? She whispered. You've made up your mind. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. Thank you, I said after a moment. She let out a bitter laugh, her shoulders trembling. Don't thank me, Brian. This isn't what I want. Neither is this, I said, gesturing vaguely between us. But here we are. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. Rachel moved out shortly after, taking only the essentials and leaving behind a few boxes in the attic. She promised to come back for them eventually, though I doubted she ever would. The house felt eerily quiet without her. At first, I welcomed the silence, but as the days stretched on, it became almost suffocating. One night, I sat on the couch with a beer, staring at the wedding photo still sitting on the mantel. It was ironic, really, how something that once symbolized love and commitment now felt like a relic of betrayal. I picked it up, studied it for a moment, then placed it face down on the mantel. Some things are better left unseen. Rachel called a week later. Her voice was hesitant, unsure. How are you? She asked. I'm fine, I said curtly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I wanted to say I'm sorry again. You've said that before, I replied, my tone flat. I know, she said, but I mean it. I really do. I'm sure you do, Rachel, I said, but it doesn't change anything. Another silence, heavier this time. I miss you, she whispered. I didn't respond. Instead, I hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time. The past was the past, and I had no intention of going back. Life after Rachel was different. It took time to adjust to the emptiness of the house, the lack of her voice, her presence. I threw myself into work, spent more time with friends, and slowly began to rebuild. The pain of betrayal lingered, but it grew duller with each passing day. One evening, as I walked through the park, I spotted a couple sitting on a bench, laughing together. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of longing, a fleeting wish for what I'd lost. But then I remembered everything that had brought me here, and the longing faded. Some losses are necessary, some endings inevitable, and sometimes moving forward is the only way to heal.